Hello and welcome to this special briefing by the Free Market Foundation. My name is David Ansara. I'm the CEO here, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Martin van Staden for a very special briefing today. We have been working very hard during this very intense period of the government negotiations following the elections on 29th May to develop a policy program that could help guide the next administration through what will surely be choppy waters in the years to come. And we have this document here, Liberty First, which is a policy agenda for South Africa's 2024 to 2029 parliamentary term. Martin van Staden is our head of policy. He was the primary author of this document. It's not just a printed document. We also have a digital version, which we'll post a link to down in the comments below. But we just thought what we would do is give a brief overview of some of the key policy recommendations contained in this document. We are also going to be hosting a live event here at our offices in Northwoods House this evening. So if you are in Gauteng and you're interested in engaging with us further, please do come along 5:30 for 6 o'clock tonight at our offices. We'll also post a link to that event below. But Martin's going to be speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes or so, just presenting some of our main policy recommendations. But we'd also like to hear from you, our audience. Please do comment down in the comment section or reply to us on whatever platform that you happen to be viewing this live stream on. But that's enough from me. I want to hand over to Martin. Martin, please do take it away.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thank you for that introduction. So hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us here this morning. It's certainly exciting times in South African politics, and that applies no less to us here at the Free Market Foundation. Up to now, we've felt for many years, really, that the South Africa's government has been a brick wall that hasn't really had any appetite for externally induced policy reform. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, there was a lot of room to influence policy directly. But since the ANC became entrenched really in a position of political dominance, it has tended to determine its policy agenda really for itself. So no matter how many millions of South Africans expressed their opposition to a particular bill, for example, the Bella bill or even the NHI bill that was recently adopted, if the ANC wanted to adopt it, it simply did, and it used its parliamentary majority to do exactly that. Now, May 29 has potentially, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it has potentially changed this dynamic. The ANC cannot do anything on its own anymore, regardless of whether the so-called government of national unity is successful and it lasts a while, or it fails and we have to have more negotiations and a different government. The reality is no single party can just do whatever it wants. The influence of Lutuli House, of course, remains very deep and very wide, but that influence is no longer ultimately determinative. So we at the Free Market Foundation felt that this was a unique opportunity for us to provide the public and the new administration with the recipe for success. And this recipe is not a trade secret. In fact, social and economic success is a perfectly charted course. Many, in fact all, of the serious problems facing South Africa today are entirely solvable, provided that we do not allow old, outdated, or discredited ideologies to veto our progress. This charted course is found in many places, including the United Nations' Human Development Index and the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. But it is also found in the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report, or as we know it, the EFW. As its name implies, the EFW measures economic freedom, and then it ranks countries according to how much or how little economic freedom obtains within their jurisdictions. So it looks at how free the markets ultimately are, or how capitalistic, really, society is allowed to be. Countries that allow people and businesses within their jurisdictions to make their own economic choices without the interference of government rank higher, and those countries who have more interventionist governments rank lower. When you compare the EFW to indices like the Human Development Index, you will immediately realize that there is a correlation, and we argue causation, between freedom and prosperity. But in the year 2000, a few years after the end of apartheid, South Africa attained its highest ranking in the EFW since it was established in the 1970s. And we ranked 47th, which at the time was in the second quartile of economic freedom. But last year, South Africa ranked 94th out of 165 countries. And that means we are in the third quartile, steadily heading in the wrong direction. What is notable really about the EFW is that it shows quite clearly, contrary to a lot of academic and activist opinion, that the poor are better off in countries with freer markets than they are in countries where government plays a more active role in the economy. In the least free economies, meaning the economies where the government is large and expansive, where free enterprise is curbed, and where private property rights are curtailed, the poorest 10% of the population, on average, earns only $1,736 per year. So that's about 31,500 Rand. That is absolutely nothing. But in the most free economies, the most capitalistic states in the world, the poorest 10% of the population, again, the poorest 10% of the population, earns about 14,204 thousand US dollars per annum. And that is about 258,000 Rand per year. That is about 8 times more than the poorest 10% in the least free economies. So that is a notable and a substantive difference. But what does it mean? It means that in those places where the government is small and unintrusive, where private property is respected and protected, where there is minimal regulation of economic activity, and where there is free trade with the rest of the world and the value of the currency is protected, the poor are much better off. The Free Market Foundation has therefore published its policy agenda, based in large part on the EFW, for the next 5 years of public policy in South Africa. And I think appropriately we decided to title it Liberty First. And that really encapsulates what our recommendation for the new government is. And as David said, the digital document is available and hard copies are available from the Free Market Foundation's office. So I'm not going to read the whole agenda for you here now, but I will very briefly explain some of the key aspects of the proposal. So the first area of concern for the EFW is size of government. In other words, what burden does the state bureaucracy represent to ordinary people, to communities, and to businesses? The smaller the state, the more money ordinary people have in their pockets to stimulate economic activity, to save, and to invest. Under each area of concern, you can see there are 5. We have stated some key examples, and these are not exhaustive. There are many other things that the government could also do, but we picked a few relatively easy and simple to understand ones just to show what the government can and really should undertake over the next 5 years for South Africa to again start climbing the ranks of the EFW and concomitantly increase human prosperity in this country. So in this case, size of government, we believe, and we have long advocated for this, that the public sector wage bill, in fact, we want the private sector wage bill to increase substantially, but the public sector wage bill should be cut substantially. And our bloated cabinet should be reduced from the more or less 30 ministers and deputy ministers now to only about 10 ministries, with a significant reduction in the number of deputy ministers where they are not strictly necessary, and really an earnest effort to balance the budget and even in time get a budget surplus. But cuts in spending are only one side of the coin. Income taxpayers have been long overdue some relief in South Africa. Every year, it seems now, we pay more and more, as if our primary purpose in life as citizens of this country is to maintain government largesse, and that cannot be the case. We must ultimately, firstly, see to our own, our own and the prosperity of our families and our communities. But not only that, every few years, South Africa introduces an entirely new tax to achieve some redistributive aim or to change the behavior of society. You think about the climate tax that is being phased in, or a plastic bag tax, which just ultimately make life more expensive for really the poorest of the poor. And this does need to stop. All non-standard taxes, except the income tax, the corporate income tax, and our sales tax, VAT, should begin to be phased out. And there should be a moratorium on further tax increases for the rest of this parliamentary term. The reality is that you cannot generate economic growth by taking scarce money out of the economy and giving it to politicians and officials. Now, if there are revenue shortfalls, this will be the key kind of rebuttal of what we are suggesting, or an attempted rebuttal. There inevitably will be revenue shortfalls, but these must be funded in a different way. And we've suggested that they should be funded in further reductions in the public sector wage bill. They should be funded with voluntary fundraising in the real world, in the NGO world, and in the commercial world. All money is generated voluntarily through persuasion and offering a better product. And governments believe that they are exempt from this principle of human nature and human reality. And our argument is, listen, if you want more money, go and raise it voluntarily. Not all money has to come from coercive extraction. And another thing is, the government's mandate must simply be reduced. Every few years, the government adds more things to its mandate. For instance, the whole infrastructure that the climate change bill, I think it's an act by now, is recommending to the government to build all these new agencies and hire all these new experts. That is the government endlessly extending its mandate, and we believe that that must start moving in the other direction to reduce any revenue shortfalls. And certainly these should not be funded through any new debt or tax. Another important aspect of reducing the size of government is the dreaded P word, privatization, which the Free Market Foundation has always also believed in and steadily advocated. It is firstly important to allow communities and businesses to compete freely with existing state enterprises like Eskom and Transnet. There should be no statutory monopoly or regulatory monopoly whatsoever for these entities. If Eskom can generate power from coal, so too the private sector should be allowed. If Transnet can build and operate a railway line, so too the private sector should be allowed. Now, this is the most important step in privatization in our view, but the second equally important, less important step, but important nonetheless, is for the government stake in state enterprises to be progressively, but noticeably, reduced until only a minority stake remains. There should also be a moratorium on the establishment of any new state enterprises for the rest of this parliamentary term, unless the privatization of a previous enterprise can fund the establishment of a new one, but only then if it is absolutely necessary. So the next area of concern is legal system and property rights. Our first proposal in this respect is for political decentralization, what we call federalization or home rule. This must include the central government devolving various functions, in particular policing, to provincial and municipal governments. Legislation should also be adopted that ensures that provinces and municipalities begin to take more direct financial responsibility for their government's endeavors. The next proposal is to strengthen the observance of the rule of law by introducing strict new guidelines, binding guidelines, for how legislation and regulations are to be made and go through that process and ultimately be adopted. This must include, for example, requiring independent feasibility and impact assessments that are done before the introduction of new legislation or regulations. There must also be rules that simply prohibit, really, ministers and regulators from adopting multiple 500-page plus regulations whenever they feel like it. You cannot have an economy and a legal system characterized by certainty, policy certainty, if this is how ministers and regulators are allowed to act. Now, private property is the foundation of any and all economic prosperity. The attacks over recent years on this crucial institution in South Africa's constitution, Section 25, must immediately be ended. The principle of market-based compensation, at least market-based compensation, when property is expropriated, must be very strictly observed. The mentality in our politics of redistribution must also go the way of the dodo. Redistribution is ideology, pure and simple. We at the Free Market Foundation believe firmly in restitution, meaning that property that was taken involuntarily from its real owners in the past must be returned to those owners or to their descendants, or their descendants must be compensated. We believe very firmly in that principle. But redistribution is about arbitrary political formulas that in turn that turn human beings into statistics and patterns. We hear a lot about patterns of ownership. That is not how you run a free and constitutional society. We need to get away from the brazen ideologizing if we want to see more serious investment in our economy. But it is not all strictly economic. Civil liberty, personal freedom, the right of the individual to conduct themselves freely and even disgustingly, if they want, is a building block of a free society. In this respect, we have proposed a deep-ranging decriminalization initiative that will see any offenses recognized on the statute book that do not clearly prohibit conduct that does tangible harm to another's life, liberty, or property to be removed from the statute book. One key example of this is repealing the new Hate Speech Act immediately. It was recently adopted and it's not yet entrenched in our law, so it can be gotten rid of quite quickly. But the Equality Act, which has been on our statute book for many years, does include hurtful expression provisions that we also think must be amended away. The common law already recognizes when speech is legally problematic, and that is when there is an incitement to violence. And we think that that is correct, and those common law rules must be observed and certainly more strictly enforced than they have been. So, of course, South Africans do say some pretty terrible things on occasion, but ultimately that has nothing to do with the law or with government, unless, as I said, violence is being threatened. The third area of concern is sound money. The South African Reserve Bank, I think we at the Free Market Foundation believe, is probably one of our proudest institutions that has not succumbed to populist demands. This state of affairs must be entrenched. We need to bolster, really, the independence of the bank and ensure that it is not subservient to anyone who is trying to score political points. The bank's primary, and I think indeed its exclusive mandate, should be to protect the value of the rand, even if that comes at the cost of some other public interest considerations. The fourth area is freedom to trade internationally. And I think we've seen that free trade has proven to be one of the modern age's kind of cheat codes for development. No longer does every single society have to do everything for itself. If someone else can do it cheaper and faster, we buy it from them. In this respect, we believe that South Africa should not be playing political games with foreign exporters using the South African consumer as a pawn. All new tariffs and subsidies adopted during the past term should be revoked, and there should be a moratorium on the introduction of any new tariffs or subsidies for this term, or certainly an increase in existing tariffs or subsidies. But the financial independence and privacy of South Africans should also be preserved. Apartheid-era foreign exchange controls must finally be done away with. These things are almost 100 years old at this stage, so that a free people, South Africans are a free people, should be able to take their money wherever they like. And the government should under no circumstances prescribe to pension fund managers and other financial services how they should invest the money that is under their care. That is a relationship between them and their clients. Now, it has been quite popular in recent years in South Africa to import American and European border concerns into our discourse. This has not really proven to be constructive at all. We should embrace freedom of movement as a catalyst for growth. As such, we should adopt totally visa-free travel for the whole African continent, and certainly for our BRICS partners. And we should encourage them to do the same for South Africans. And we must end the immense discretion that immigration officers have when they consider visa applications from further afield. The stories from people who are trying to come into South Africa for business or even tourism, simply having their visas denied for ridiculous and arbitrary reasons, that must really end. That should not be something that keeps South Africa from growing, whether in its tourism industry or any other industry. And the fifth and final area which the EFW speaks to is regulation. I think it is inarguably one of South Africa's biggest crises today, being our astronomical rate of unemployment. People can speculate, and they do speculate about why this is, but it comes down to this. There is a barrier of policy built between employers and prospective employees. As such, the Free Market Foundation is proposing that job seekers be empowered at their own initiative to opt themselves out of the application of harmful labor laws through the introduction of a job seeker's exemption certificate. The Minister of Labor must also be prohibited from extending bargaining council agreements to entities that were not parties to those bargaining council processes. That must speak for itself. Anyone who is not part of a negotiation should certainly not be bound by the outcome of that negotiation. There is also the matter of healthcare. The right of the individual to determine their own healthcare affairs is so intimate, really, and basic that it is astounding to us at the FMF that government can so brazenly attempt to interfere in these decisions through the National Health Insurance Scheme. We therefore propose that the new NHI Act be repealed and that any policies dedicated to it also be withdrawn. Universal healthcare, which is obviously a noble idea, is being used by our political class as a euphemism for nationalized, or think about Escomified healthcare. And to us, that is a terrible and an unjustifiable path to go down. Instead, medical schemes and health insurers must be allowed to offer low-cost products so that the poor can access high-quality private healthcare. Currently, the law prohibits schemes from having low-cost benefit options. But we dare not forget about education, which is also an important area of society that we cannot afford to sacrifice at the altar of political expediency. The Basic Laws Amendment Act, the BELA Act, must be repealed so that school governing bodies regain their authority to determine school policy at public schools. Teachers and parents on the ground always know better than some faraway government bureaucrat. And associated with this is that the government must stop trying to interfere with parents who are homeschooling their children. And it should be also stay away from private schools. The Constitution tells us, I think, very clearly that the government may only interfere in private or home education if there is racial discrimination or if that education is of a lesser quality than public education. And I don't think that happens very often at all. But that is the only thing that the Constitution allows government to interfere over. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I must emphasize again that reforms in favor of economic freedom have worked around the world without exception. There is no exception. There is not a single example anywhere of a free society, a country that has made policy reforms in favor of free enterprise that ranks low on human development scores. That just does not happen. Liberty works, and putting liberty first on the policy agenda for the next 5 years will yield dividends for all South Africans. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I thought that was an excellent summary of the paper that we've produced. But I also think that quote there, I think, is very apt. The argument for liberty is an argument against the use of coercion to prevent others from doing better. And I think that really is, in one sentence, the essence of our policy recommendations in this document. Okay, so we have a few questions that have come through, and I would encourage everyone who is watching just to please post your comments in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Okay, so we have a question here. Have recent developments vis-a-vis the election or the GNU really improved the chances of reform? Feels as unlikely as ever. That's from Anonymous. What do you think there? Do you think we're just kind of whistling in the wind here? I mean, is there a real opportunity for reform from this government?
I think compared to a month ago, certainly. So that might not be saying much. The room for reform might still be very limited. But like I said a bit earlier, there is now at least a potential chance for policy reform, whereas previously, if that reform did not kind of congruate with the ANC's own kind of internal policy priorities, it would simply not be considered. But now that we're going to have a government and potentially multiple governments over the next 5 years that are necessarily governments of compromise, there is at least small cracks, I think, where you can start drip feeding policy into. Now, like the rest of South Africa, the FMF is waiting and seeing. So we'll need to see what happens next with these negotiations, whether there's more or less room for policy reform. But ultimately, however these negotiations turn out, the FMF will be pushing for these reforms and trying to find those little cracks, those little openings to drive these points home.
Yeah, and I think that there is an opportunity there, and there are going to be concessions, trade-offs that are going to need to be made between the negotiating partners. And I think, although this document, the subheading is 2024 to 2029, these are timeless recommendations. This is not necessarily rooted in the present day. These are the time-tested approaches that have helped to secure freedom and prosperity for millions of people around the world in different countries. So these are not novel recommendations. The path to prosperity is charted, as we note in the document. All right. And then we have a question here, which is a related one, which is, does the GNU have sufficient mandate to implement these liberal policies? And I would say that, definitely that should be on the policy agenda. What are your thoughts there, Martin?
Yeah, look, mandate is a very interesting concept in kind of democratic theory. And the way it's always played out in South Africa is that whenever the government wants to do something that it thinks is necessary, even when it doesn't have a mandate, it says, well, we have to do this, it's necessary. Think, for example, of load shedding. Did the government ever have a mandate to implement load shedding? I would say absolutely not. No one ever voted in favor of load shedding. But the government said, well, we don't have a choice, it's got to happen. But when we point out, for instance, that, listen, you have to cut the public sector wage bill, you actually don't have a choice, given how this is dragging our economy down, or you have to privatize Eskom, given how its collapse is dragging our economy down. There is no choice. It's necessary. The government says, well, no, we don't have a mandate, so we can't do it. So I'm always wary when people start talking about mandates. We as classical liberals believe that the government always has only one key mandate, and that is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people. And that is transcendent. It does not matter who is in power or why they are in power. That is government's mandate. So certainly, from our perspective, the GNU doesn't only just have a mandate to implement liberal policies, but it's an absolute imperative for it to implement liberal policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's ideology on the one hand and reality on the other. And I think for the last 30 years, we've been witnessing a very ideological program on behalf of the ANC government. Uh, Socialism, redistributive policies, very high taxes, protectionist policies as well. So, and that has real world consequences. And so, whether you like it or not, we're going to have to reduce our deficit. We're going to have to reduce government spending and the size of the debt burden. We're going to have to liberalize our labor market, because it's only for so much longer that millions of people are going to be willing to be unemployed. All right, we've got quite a few more questions coming through here. Let me see in the comments. Okay, well, Leanne, she says, how can we mitigate the potential exploitation of poor and unskilled workers if the minimum wage is abolished, given that the primary argument against its removal is the risk of their exploitation? Well, I have a few thoughts on that, which is that the number one major problem with our labor market is the very tight and restrictive labor regulations, which are ostensibly designed to protect workers. But that protection is at the expense of the millions of unemployed people in this country. So we have, on the expanded definition, 42% unemployment rate. And those people are essentially locked out of the labor market. And if you're a poor person in South Africa, you don't have skills, you don't have capital, you don't have social capital, as in networks and so on. The only thing you have is your ability to work. And what something like a minimum wage does is it robs you of that one opportunity that you have to advance yourself. And so minimum wage might be good for some of the people who are lucky enough to have a job, who are on the lowest rung. But everybody below that can get stuffed. That's the implication, right? So we need people to be able to freely contract their labor in exchange for an income. And it's our belief that many people are doing this already in defiance of minimum wage legislation. And as Gabriel Krause of the Institute of Race Relations often points out, in South Africa, our minimum wage is almost the same as our median wage, whereas in other developed countries, it's at around 10%. So that's very, very high. So the real minimum wage in South Africa is zero. Martin, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that the common law has, over many hundreds of years, developed to recognize what is real labor exploitation. And the common law has developed rules around those things and prohibited employers from doing that. Now, those are timeless, call it almost naturally exploitative and abusive practices by employers. What we see in South African labor law is that a very ideological conception of so-called exploitation was breathed into our law. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that Marxism is very much underlying our Labor Relations Act and so forth, which is ultimately, if you go back to Marx, is based on the idea of employers ultimately robbing the surplus value that is generated by these exploited workers. Now, this is a totally academic kind of, it's an interesting theory. It's a very interesting thing to kind of grapple with. But when you have someone who is unemployed, that is the least of their worries, as you've alluded to, David. They do not care. They need to put food on the table, and the only way for them to get closer to that and ultimately to prosperity is to start working somewhere. Rather than sitting idly at home, and luckily, I think this is a good thing. That luckily most people aren't sitting idly at home. They are going to work in defiance of these laws, and they are creating wealth for themselves and their families, limited as though it might be. That is why people in South Africa are not starving. If people were law-abiding, this terrible concept of law-abiding, if everyone was really law-abiding, we would have a lot more humanitarian crises in South Africa, just given how labor law shuts people out of the economy. So just an answer to that question, if we're talking about exploitation, the common law does protect against that, and we think the common law must be our kind of lodestar in labor regulation, and we need to get rid of the academic conception of exploitation, which really only is advocated by people who are quite wealthy in universities and who already have jobs, and whereas the poorest of the poor they're not dwelling on this academic concept of exploitation. So I would rather we modify our thinking around exploitation.
All right, Martin. Well, for at least the time being, it seems that load shedding has abated, right? But that does not necessarily mean that the need for privatization of state-owned assets has gone away. The same inefficiencies remain, the same opportunities for rent-seeking and corruption are still there. And Eskom is not the only state-owned enterprise. We also have Transnet, PRASA, South African Airways. What informs our view that we should privatize these assets? And as somebody asks in the comments, which private company would actually want to own any of these failing SOEs?
Well, just to kind of grab onto that, maybe very few, and in that case, you simply liquidate and you get rid of it. That would be our argument. And that's why the most important aspect of privatization really is to open the market up, to make sure that we're not entirely reliant on Eskom, and therefore someone must buy Eskom, otherwise it has to remain a state enterprise. Rather open the market up so that there are various competitors. So if no one wants to buy Eskom, well, then you just kind of let it die. So what informs it? It's playing out right in front of our eyes. Eskom has had no incentive to really reform. It relies entirely on political direction, and this has been the case for decades, for 100 years now, since its establishment in 1922. It has always been a political animal, and it was not allowed to generate a profit for the longest period of its existence. That's why we had such wonderful, cheap electricity in South Africa. So that's a problem, because the entity does not respond to what is actually happening in the market. And we may have had many years of wonderfully cheap electricity, but not responding to the market applies both ways. So at some point we needed more energy, and the economy said we need more power, and Eskom said, well, that's not our instructions, that's not our political instruction at this moment. And as a result, we sat with many years and trillions of rands worth of economic damage and load shedding. The same really can be said for Transnet, the economic kind of infrastructure for South African society, whereas a private company would have taken real and kind of decisive steps to ensure that engines aren't stolen off of its trains. Transnet has kind of shrugged its shoulders and said, listen, we can't really do anything about this, because we're not actually, as shareholders, losing money. I mean, some taxpayer somewhere is losing some money, shame. But our shareholders, of which there is only one, the state, is not losing money, so we don't really care. And our view is, listen, we need these companies to start caring like a private business would care, because that's the only thing that ultimately generates better quality products, cheaper quality products, cheaper products at a higher quality. That is the clearest way shown around the world for kind of good, well-performing utilities. Now, a lot of people will say, but yeah, there's state power companies in South Korea and so on, and these perform very well. So yes, of course, and we're not saying that it's impossible for a state company to perform well, but the ingredients for that are completely absent in South Africa. You need a lot of social consensus in the society. You need a very kind of a culture of wanting to deliver a good product and so on. And we can theorize about whether that is, we have civil servants who want to deliver a good product in South Africa, but the evidence is there. We don't have that culture of service delivery in South Africa's political class, and I don't think we're going to get there, at least for 100 years. It takes time to develop such culture. So in theory, it's possible in the future for us to have well-performing state entities. But until we meet all those criteria for that to come into place, we need to privatize, and we need to privatize very radically.
Yeah, we need to deal with the state-owned enterprises that we have, not the state-owned enterprises that we wish we had. This is not South Korea. This is South Africa. Okay, well, I think that's about as much time as we have, but there was a very interesting final question, which is that, and I think this is very relevant, what is the biggest risk that we face if the GNU fails to implement these policy recommendations? And I think that's a very appropriate point to end the stream.
Yeah, so I mean, the GNU process is fraught with risks, even if it succeeds. There is not only the point of if it fails. Look, the worst that can happen is that not that these things are not implemented, but that the bad policies are implemented. So I've said it before, and I think that if South Africa kind of doesn't reform and we kind of slog along for the next 5 years in the same position that we are, that would be bad, but that's not the worst outcome. That's one of the least bad outcomes, and I would personally be okay with if we can get that. The risk is if some of the more radical political parties that seemingly have grown even more radical in the last 2 weeks after the election, if they come close to power and they do amend the constitution, not only to remove the protections for private property rights, but also to replace constitutional supremacy with parliamentary sovereignty, for instance. These are the types of things that you do not want to see happen, because that would just, all the bad things that we experience now, just dial that up to 20, and that is what we will experience. Now, I don't think that's where we're going. I think that if the GNU works and it implements some of these policies, that'll be great. South Africa will very tangibly improve. If the GNU works, but it doesn't implement any of these policies, then that's kind of going to be same old for the last, what we've seen for the last 15 years. The problem there is we'll potentially lose out on having a strong parliamentary opposition, but that's a void that organizations like the Free Market Foundation are very happy to fill from civil society side, to be a constructive critic in the public discourse. So I think those are the two kind of most likely options: is either GNU succeeds or fails. But I don't think that the disaster of having some of our more radical parties coming into government and upending the whole apple cart, I don't think that is going to happen this term. I think what we've seen over the last few weeks is that there is a surprising, to me, really, level of political maturity from the powers that be. The ANC very gracefully accepted electoral defeat in a way that I think is commendable, and that does not seem to me like a party that is ready to allow the entire constitutional order to be summarily destroyed with a new government. So I think the forces of rationality are probably quite strong in South Africa still. That's not to say things are going to be great. It could still just be more of the same. But through it all, the FMF will be here, and we'll be keeping a close eye on these things. And we are very consistently planning to keep advocating for liberal policy, for free market policy, even if a lot of the euphoria and so on around the GNU says, listen, let's quiet down criticism and let's kind of go along to get along and so on. Don't expect any of that from the FMF. We're here, and we're going to hunt liberty for the next 5 years and beyond.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. We shouldn't outsource our responsibility, our civic responsibility, to politicians. Politicians have their own interests. Politics is obviously important, and we watch it very closely, but it's also about building capacity outside of the state. And I think very important for South Africa's ongoing success is its vibrant civil society organizations such as the FMF, which I encourage you to fund and contribute to our work advancing liberty in South Africa. But the best way you can help us, if you can't fund us, is to go ahead, read this report, share it with your friends and family. It's very short. a very visual kind of document. And then also please do like this video and share it on whichever are your preferred platforms. But that's it from the Free Market Foundation team. Do remember to stay free. And if you are in Joburg tonight, please do come along to our live event. And if you are not able to make it, you can also catch the live stream of that as well. All right, that's it. Stay free.